Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Project Mouse. Now that the upper hull structure is complete, it's time to start adding the detail. The open top of the hull needs to be capped off to support the hatches, grilles and other detail parts. To do this, I 3D printed the upper deck parts in ABS on my Ultimaker 3D printer. The deck parts and the hull have to be trimmed to fit together, but that's no problem with a Dremel and a coarse file. I used the same plastic magic as before to bond everything together, and added thin wedges to the front and rear glasses to correct the angles. As in the previous episode, I used the plastic magic in combination with ABS shavings to fill any large gaps. This method works really well for creating strong bonds at joints, as well as beefing up any areas where more ABS is needed. It's a pretty messy process, but very effective, especially along the upper edges of the hull, where I have to file back the ABS to create the distinctive chamfered edges. After letting the solvent fully cure for a couple of days, I cleaned up the hull, marked out the chamfers, and started to carefully file the profile. I had wanted to get to this stage for a long time, as it's another distinctive feature of the mouse completed, and is one that allows me to judge how close I am to getting to the character of the real thing. Then it was on to another round of texturing, using the same milliput process that I'd used on the turret and lower hull. The amount of surface area to texture meant that this stage took a very long time. I was also careful not to have too strong a texture, as the period photo showed the surfaces to be fairly smooth. With the texture in place, it was time to mark out and add all the weld seams. I found that using a steel straight edge with an appropriately sized drill bit in the Dremel works well for removing enough material for the first stage. Some of the shorter welds were prepared by freehand, as were the transitions to different faces. Now I have to add the weld detail. This I do with milliput. I start by mixing up equal amounts of the two parts. This has to be carried out very thoroughly, otherwise you'll get uncured areas which need to be dug out and refilled. I then roll out a thin sausage of milliput and begin pushing it into the weld joints. The excess milliput is then carefully removed, and I can begin to add the weld bead texture. To do this, I made a tool from a piece of brass rod. The small end is similar to a fine screwdriver, while the other end is wider and more rounded. Using a combination of these two ends being pushed into the milliput, I managed to recreate the welds. Any welds I wasn't happy with, I just smoothed over and tried again. While all the milliput was curing, I decided to take a little diversion. The plan for the mouse is to mount it on a diorama base with a figure to give it a sense of scale and context. I've chosen to sculpt the designer behind the mouse tank, Ferdinand Porsche. Most of the photos I have of Porsche have him with his hands in his pockets. In fact, most of those standing around the mouse seem to be in similar poses. At the test facility, Porsche is typically wearing a long overcoat and hat. This, I decided, was how I was going to sculpt my subject. I discovered that the proportions of a typical human figure were 7.5 heads tall, and printed out a set of scale drawings for a 5'9" man. I started by soldering up a rough brass armature, which I could pose and use as a base to work from. Bending and trimming the brass roughly to shape, I added milliput to the shoulders and hips. I used insulation tape to mark where the soles of the feet should finish. I then progressively added more milliput to flesh out the basic human form, and trying to follow the line of the brass armature. And here's the rough figure, just in milliput. Checking back against photos, I decided to shorten him to 5'6" and tweak his arms a bit. And this is where I'm at so far. I've started adding the clothes and hat, but I still have a lot of detail to add, as well as tackle the head and face. For a first attempt at a figure in this scale, I'm very pleased. I still have a lot to learn, but I have found figure sculpting to be very satisfying. I really look forward to seeing the end result standing next to the mouse. As well as figure sculpting, I've been designing the detail parts for the upper hull in CAD. These were then prepared and 3D printed on my Photocentric Precision 1.5 and came out really well. There are a lot of parts to clean up and fit to the upper hull. Some of these parts, such as the lights, exhausts and rear brackets, are pretty vulnerable in resin, so I'll cast and duplicate them in pewter. The main engine grille was printed in one piece, with no supports, and this is how it came out, with no cleaning up. The rear fuel tank was 3D printed in 3 sections, and reproduced every piece of detail superbly. The main engine covers, grilles and hatches are now roughly fitted to the hull. All the parts now have to be cleaned up and fitted, but that'll have to wait till the next episode, when I'll have the mouse in primer and finally ready for paint. I hope you find Project Mouse interesting and enjoy seeing the progress. If you do, hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel to see more from Staples and Vine. If you have any questions about Project Mouse, just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.